So next we have, please welcome Dr. Marian Rexer, Dr. Woo-Young Lee, and Dawn Burchell to present their research about how companies use internal audit to minimize the risk of third-party bribing employees. Very interesting topic.
Thank you. I'm actually glad Justin mentioned GDP, and I was quick looking for my facts because 16% of GDP is related to fraud. It was just, I was trying to look for the exact number on. It's actually not part of today's paper, but I wrote it, it's part of the formal paper. So this research we presented, the three of us, June and Dawn and I presented at an international conference in March while we were still doing interviews. So we're getting there. And you'll see what happens. So this third-party bribery is a really big deal. 90% of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is linked to third parties. Half of US organizations had at least one fraud, with an average of 6 frauds, and half of those frauds were due to third parties. It's becoming a bigger and bigger focus. It really just started in 2018. The International Organization for Internal Auditors, the Institute of Internal Auditors, decided to make it a focus. And while there's literature on fraud theory, business ethics, and internal audit reporting, there's really nothing on third parties bribing employees. Most bribery research was from the company bribing an official to help them get the organization. But there's actually been a lot of fraud, and we actually know of it. Facebook employees took bribes to reactivate banned accounts. Amazon employees took bribes to leak customer data. And we all know about Varsity Blues, where employees were bribed so wealthy students could be admitted. The really interesting thing about the scandal is the financials for each of these organizations didn't change. Yale didn't lose any students because the soccer coach was bribed. Amazon didn't lose any customers. They just bought from one supplier versus another. So what's being done and who's responsible to make sure something's happening? And it's not that I don't want to spend time on theory. We're all academics and we throw theories around for fun. So we looked at social norms to help us understand the individual and social factors. Individuals misjudge it, and they believe everybody does it. And societies try to address it with anti-corruption laws. But yet, we still have fraud. So then we looked at the macro and micro levels. At the macro level, the behaviors, there's so many different factors. Thinking about how somebody's got to commit fraud for their own organization, it's very individual. But there's also the organizational, the control system, internal controls. And at the micro level, people are saying, oh, it's up to their own personality factors. So how does that all work? And the interesting thing is each of those theories fits within the fraud triangle, which is a very big theory for auditors. This is, one of the bread and butter theories out there. So what do organizations do and how do they manage this risk? Well, if you've got the board of directors, external auditors, management, and internal auditors, they're considered the 4 pillars. If there's fraud, it's an evidence that one of those pillars failed. Now, internal controls are really management's responsibility. So organizations should have a robust internal control system to limit third-party influences, and then the internal auditors can do their job to assess those controls. Management is responsible for the controls, and they can manipulate the information. So the Institute of Internal Auditor Standards, they don't require that the internal auditors find fraud because that would be too difficult, but they provide guidance to get you there. So now, how this comes about becomes part of this guidance. A few years ago, internal auditing shifted from looking at each system, the purchasing system, cash management, et cetera, to process-based. And that gave a more global view. But this new focus and the various forms of corruption shifted from internal auditing to a risk-based approach. And we're all doing risk analysis ourselves. So not only do they have to have it, they're getting influenced by organizations. And we talked about the governance issues. Well, the Department of Justice and the SEC fined Walmart $137 million just for not maintaining an anti-corruption system. And Quad Graphics, part of their fine was because they didn't even do any audits of their anti-bribery system. So something really needs to be done, and they're kind of forcing it into the internal auditor area. So their recommendations are really two approaches, and you could do either one of them. You can audit each component of the program, or you can incorporate how you look at your anti-bribery or your anti-corruption programs in the audits. So when it's all said and done, a little bit of each, little bit of individual looking at certain, they'll get back to that risk theory idea. But we've got two issues. Companies need to control for third parties and briberies, and developing controls is difficult because each bribery instance in each department might be different, and it might be, well, we know it's secretive. So companies have to audit their programs, and yet a survey showed 30% of people in a company don't know their company's policy. So what's going on? Are companies doing the work they're required to do? So our study is a descriptive study. We wanted to know, did we make progress? What's the status today? Now, given the scandal since the heavy fine, we want our idea is to describe the policies and the perceptions of those people relating to this internal audit function. It's not something you can quick send a survey out. It's like sending a survey saying, do you cheat on your taxes? People are going to say no, but yet how everybody cheats would be a little bit different. So you'd have to do something different. So we had interviews. Okay, we used purposeful sampling, and we looked at internal auditors and departments that had been audited by internal auditors. We developed an internal guide for all of the subjects. And the really cool thing is, I mentioned the international organization, the Institute of Internal Auditors. They actually supported our request. They thought this was such an interesting study. They asked their public sector guidance committee to be involved, and we actually interviewed many of those employees, or not employees, the committee members. So we developed our survey, and we're still compiling. We just finished interviewing our 16th organization. But we've interviewed various people. We spoke with professionals from food manufacturing, car sales, casinos, aerospace, pharmaceuticals, and even real estate management. We also talked to people from all over the US, and a quarter were international from Canada and South Africa. So we wanted to assess the risk that employees were being bribed. Now, what I'll first do is that our study will first talk about the risk assessment side, and then we'll go over each of the dimensions on the control side. So we first said, do you think your employees are at risk of being bribed? And some said, nope. And they said, and it's not necessary that we do that. So then they went on to kind of defend their actions and said, they have enough controls around the individual that they don't worry about third parties. Then we had the group, they said, yeah, we know it's out there, but what we do is we look at what they might want, and we control the employees again. So here they don't look at it, but kind of defended it. Here they said, yeah, we look at it, but if we control the employee, we don't have to worry about the fraud. And then we had the group that actually said, yeah, we look at third-party influences. They look at everything. Some of them from vetting third parties to looking at the employee who recommended they get to be a third party. And they're very, very tight about all the controls they have. So that's what happens on the risk assessment side. On the control development side, what we have is people put them into categories. Now, what was interesting to me as an auditor is internal auditors divided them into preventive controls and mitigating controls. Managers could care less. They said, we don't care if they're preventive, mitigating, or if they're in the audit. We think employees will not commit fraud because they're at risk of being found. So we don't think it's a big issue. As an auditor, I think it's a big issue. On the control side, the preventive controls are here. Now, everyone, auditors, managers, mention training employees. A few mention codes of ethics and signing statements about understanding the controls. Some only do this once. The day you're hired, you read your things, you sign off, boom. Others break it down into several trainings during the year, and they keep them small so that way employees, their brains don't head off in the la-la land, and they keep everybody current. And the other big topic was limiting access. This was a theme, and it was everything from they restricted who could order supplies to certain dual signatures. We even had one that had a team approach, and they said, you can't access everything, so you'd have to bribe the entire team in order to be successful. Now, we're going to come back to this, but while we're talking about limiting access, I've got to tell you about my second favorite control. They created hardware without any thumb drives, so you couldn't copy any information. And this is getting to be big in California, where you can opt out of having your information sold. But if someone wants to sell customer data, they could sit and have to take pictures on their phone all day. Now, my favorite limiting information was who had what information. This wasn't just one company, but the ones that really analyzed third parties and restricted access to their employees felt they could keep their employees from being bribed because they didn't put them in a position to be bribed. So that means don't allow them to have information someone else would want. So the sales manager responsible for selling cookies to Amazon could only see data related to cookies and only to Amazon. This keeps them from seeing the wholesale price for the Walmart account. And they don't have to worry about other products at their own company. And the person from Walmart can't be bribed to give information about the wholesale prices to Amazon or Wegmans or et cetera. So that was a great limiting access. And then the last preventive control was looking at the third parties. One of the individuals we spoke with was so concerned about third parties, whether they could be related or live with, that they actually do an address check and compare the bank deposit information. And this is a really big deal because a few subjects were reanalyzing the information because they just found out about a bribery within their organization. And then the international subjects were very direct with us. They specifically mentioned they had employees being bribed or attempted to be bribed by quote unquote the mafia or quote unquote the syndicate. And they know this, they know organized crime is a big influence for them. So they're very concerned about third parties. So that's what they do to prevent them. On the mitigating side, we've got other controls that are in place. Traditional tip lines were mentioned, but some just have them, and some actually say that they have them in several different locations with several different languages because they want everyone to feel free to go ahead and provide a tip. Then there's multiple reconciliations. This seems to be great across the board, and it's the only time where someone told us they had issues during the pandemic, because oftentimes they'll do a reconciliation for somebody in a different department, and that was a little trickier, but nobody really said anything else about the pandemic imitating. And these are old school. This is the new school. IT's got all sorts of controls. Flags are raised if the ratios change, if someone downloads data, if someone's email has a large attachment. We had an employee who was flagged because they didn't update their software within so many days. And there's monitoring of everything you can think about, okay? And then this one's coming. This is what we don't know. We're happy, and the managers were happy, auditors and managers, because they thought IT lets them dig deeper each year. So that the control is their ability, the mitigating controls, their abilities to test more. And it's more and more. One was actually excited because he hasn't had a finding in 4 years, but then he laughed and said he can't wait to have a finding because he can turn around and develop a control for it. And then there's the audit side. You might think there's just a financial statement audit, but actually certain organizations are required to have all sorts of audits. And managers, as I mentioned before, thought this was a preventive control because people feel they're going to be caught. And so depending on the industry, you could have all of these types of audits conducted. Some are conducted every year, some are conducted every couple months. And the audits, the general financial audits, they're the things the internal audit department do. They're pretty much in line with theory. You assess the risk, you design tests to focus on the risks, and you design other risky areas, and then you perform your tests, find any issues, your findings, and you've got to have management come up with new controls to fix your findings. So the form of the audit's not the problem. Okay, so getting back to where we started from, we have a descriptive study. We've got information that's going out. Are they meeting the international standards? Well, they're told you have to audit each component of a program and you have to incorporate assessment of anti-bribery. What's interesting is there's a lot of people who are doing risk assessment and they're looking at third parties, but not one person from within the United States mentioned anti-bribery or anti-corruption, whereas all of the organizations outside the United States actually use that terminology. So that's our review of what we have so far. We're still doing ongoing analysis. I'm guessing we're going to end up with a list of controls that this is what the bare minimum does, and this is what people are doing for third-party fraud. Where we'd like to go with it is I'd love to talk to managers that don't have an internal audit department. I talked to one who does, I can't tell you where she works because we promised we wouldn't say, but she's responsible for credit card fraud. And she can see the last 4 years Social Security, she can see your credit card number and your address. And I know I've used this organization several times. I'm going to assume most of you have as well. There's no restrictions on her. She was just told, don't look up the famous people, but she knows colleagues that have. So I really like to take this study and go to that next level there. And then poor Wajun, I dragged him into the study with me because I want to see what happens with the NCAA. Varsity Blues could have been discovered, but it wasn't. Stanford didn't lose any students because their coaches were bribed. So what are schools going to do with this? There's a basketball scandal, and now that players can profit from their own likeness, what's going to happen with that? My gut says that, they already have agents, despite that being against policy. So I'd really like to look into that information in the future. So that's where we are, and thank you very much. If you've got any questions, happy to hear them.
Yeah, thank you, Marianne, for your great research topic. I hope we can discuss the issue in depth, but probably we can, due to the time constraint, we probably can only take 1 or 2 very brief questions. So any questions? So I may have a question. So you said you interview some managers. So can you share with us how many interviews you have conducted, and then how many questions, the length of the interview?
Yes, we did 16 interviews. They were designed to last about 20 minutes, but most of them actually lasted about 35, 40 minutes.
Right. So
they were very interesting because once people started talking, they kept going. So when they told us they found fraud or they found bribery or they found employee theft, they wanted to tell you the whole story.
And just wanted to say something, make one comment about this study. Marianne is an expert in this area. I was not. But we interviewed 16 individuals and we transcribed all the interviews. And based on the transcriptions we had, we came up with these themes. So Marianne just shared some of the themes that we were able to identify from their answers. So we followed all qualitative research, responsibilities like credibility, transferability, dependability, and credibility. So we ensure that we follow all the quality research process. Just wanted to let you all know.